It was about a month ago, during winter break. I'm 23, in college, and I'd been spending most of my free time doing DoorDash to make some extra cash. This particular day, I'd already done a few hours earlier, but by around 9 p.m., I got bored and decided to head out for a couple more orders. I picked up a big order, 2 full bags of food, and started driving to the address. It was in a neighborhood I'd never been to before. The GPS led me down this long, winding road lined with normal houses, but as I got closer to the end, it felt like I was driving into the middle of nowhere. The road seemed to dead end, but the GPS insisted I keep going straight. Finally, my headlights lit up a small wooden gate with numbers on it. It matched the delivery address, but something felt off. None of the other houses had gates, and this one was set way back, down a long, private driveway. I got out of the car, pushed the gate open, it wasn't locked, and drove down this wide gravel path through a cluster of trees. At the end was a single house. It was older than the others, all wood, and kind of small. The GPS confirmed it was the right place, so I grabbed the food and got out of the car. I left the engine running so my headlights lit up the front of the house, but I noticed something strange, none of the lights inside were on. Not a single one. And the front door was wide open. I walked up to the porch, the bags in hand, and the silence hit me. It was so quiet, like no one was home. But this was a huge order, why would someone order all this food and not be here? I started setting the bags down when a voice called out from somewhere upstairs. "Hey, just bring it up here for me, bud." There was a staircase right by the entrance, but it was pitch black. I couldn't see the top of the stairs. Against my better judgment, I took a couple of steps inside. "Attaboy, I'll grab it from you right up here," the voice said again, coming from the top of the stairs, somewhere in that pocket of darkness I couldn't see into. The stillness of the house, the silence, the open door, it all made my skin crawl. I snapped out of it, backed away, and dropped the food on the porch. I didn't wait around. I ran back to my car, got in, and drove off. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. But a few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I looked up the address. Turns out, the house wasn't supposed to be occupied. It was abandoned, owned by the state. What, or who, was waiting for me at the top of those stairs? I'm just glad I never found out. I used to work at this really rundown bowling alley in my small town. It was one of those family-owned places, small, kind of trashy, and not the best, but for some reason, it was a popular spot in our town. I think it was because it was one of the only places open 24/7 where people could hang out. At least, it used to be. This happened back in December. I was working the dreaded 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift, which was almost always dead. But this night was even worse. A huge snowstorm was rolling through town, and from the moment I clocked in, not a single customer showed up. I spent the first couple of hours cleaning up all the lanes except for one, just in case a group came in later. I checked the windows, and the parking lot was completely empty. Snow was piling up fast, so much that I wasn't sure anyone could even drive through it unless a plow came by. After a while, I pulled up a chair by the window, sat down, and just stared outside. There wasn't much else to do. The place didn't have cameras, and there was no one around to watch me, so taking long breaks or even napping on slow nights was easy to get away with. Another hour or so went by, and I was starting to doze off when I heard it, a loud thud from behind the bowling lanes. It jolted me awake. I got up and walked toward the back room, trying to figure out what it could have been. Maybe it was something to do with the snowstorm outside. The back room was where all the pins and bowling balls were stored, along with the machines that ran everything. It was basically a long hallway that ran the full length of the building. When I opened the door, it was pitch black inside. At first, I didn't hear or see anything. But then I looked down. There was water on the floor, and it was forming a very clear pattern, footsteps. My face went pale. "Hello? Who's in here?" I called out, my voice echoing down the hallway. I took a few steps forward, calling out again, but there was no response. That's when I saw it. Taped to the wall was an envelope. I pulled it down and opened it. Inside were Polaroid pictures, of me. Pictures of me working alone that night. There were shots of me cleaning the lanes, walking around, and one that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of me sitting by the window, and it looked like it had been taken just a few feet behind me. I felt like I was going to faint. I dropped the envelope and ran back to the front desk, my heart pounding. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911. I tried to wait, but the silence of the building, the unknown of what was going on, started to overwhelm me. I couldn't stay inside. I ran out to my car and waited there, despite the snowstorm. The police actually showed up really quickly, within 2 or 3 minutes. But whoever had been stalking me that night was gone. They left no traces behind. Of course, the bowling alley didn't have any cameras, so there was nothing else to go on. I don't know what that person was trying to do. Maybe it was some sick joke, or maybe it was something worse. Whatever it was, I'm just glad I got out of there. Nothing else happened after that, but I quit a couple of months later. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me that night, and I didn't want to find out what they might have done next. This happened at the beginning of March last year. Winter was winding down, but the mornings were still frosty, and the air had that lingering chill. It was just warm enough, though, for me to start getting back into my outdoor hobbies, hiking, camping, and biking. I'd been cooped up for the last 3 months, so I was eager to get outside again. One day, I drove out to a spot I'd visited the previous fall. It was a secluded area, far from the usual trails, and I liked it because it was quiet and unpopular, just a peaceful place to relax and enjoy nature alone. I parked on the side of the road and hiked about 45 minutes down to the campsite. It wasn't much, just a small dirt clearing with a bit of an overlook into the forest. I set up my gear as the sun began to dip below the horizon. I've always liked arriving at campsites late, eating a quick meal, and going to sleep right away. After setting up, I went to gather some sticks to prep for a small fire. Once I had everything ready, I walked over to the overlook to watch the sunset. But I wasn't there for more than a minute when I noticed something strange. Down the hill, nestled among the trees, was a campfire. It wasn't far away, and I could see it clearly. What was odd, though, was that there was no one around it, no tent, no chairs, no people. The fire was completely unattended. That was not only dangerous but also really strange. Fires don't burn forever, so someone had to have lit it recently. I figured they'd be back soon, so I sat and watched it for a while. An hour passed, and the sun had fully set, but there was still no sign of anyone down there. Strangely, the fire seemed to grow larger, almost like someone had added full logs to keep it burning longer. I started to get worried. I was close enough that if the fire got out of control, it could spread to my campsite. I decided to go down and check it out, maybe even put it out myself if no one else was around. It was only about a 2-minute walk, but with it being so dark, I had to use my flashlight. When I reached the fire, the area was eerily quiet. The only sound was the crackling of the flames and the occasional pop of burning wood. The fire was huge, way too big to be safe, and there were still more logs underneath that hadn't caught yet. Whoever had done this clearly didn't care about the risk. I started grabbing wet soil and tossing it onto the fire to smother the flames. It took about 5 minutes, but I eventually got it under control. Once the fire was out, the area was plunged into darkness and silence. I turned my flashlight back on and started heading back to my campsite. But as I was packing up my gear, I heard footsteps nearby. I looked up and saw the outline of someone walking toward my campsite. They stopped about 50 yards away, just standing there in the dark. "Hey, did you light that fire?" I called out. No response. Hello. I see you out there. Can you answer me? I tried again, but they just stood there, silent. An eerie feeling washed over me. I didn't want to stick around to find out who they were or what they wanted. I finished packing as quickly as I could, keeping an eye on the figure the whole time. They didn't move, just stood there, watching me. As soon as I was ready, I slung my bag over my shoulders and started walking back to my car. The figure stayed there, unmoving, until I was out of sight. I drove straight home and reported the incident to the police, but they never found anything. To this day, I have no idea who that person was or what they were doing out there. Were they trying to start a forest fire? Or had they seen me arrive and lit the fire to get my attention? I'm just glad I didn't stay to find out. A few winters ago, I was working from home as a customer service rep. That night, I had an afternoon shift from 4 p.m. to midnight. I went up to my office, closed the door, and got to work. The first half of my shift was uneventful, it flew by, and I took a quick break for dinner before getting back to it. But after that, things slowed down. I sat at my desk, staring at the blank screen, waiting for tickets to come through. Out of nowhere, I heard a noise behind me. It was loud, coming from somewhere in the house. I pulled off my headphones, turned toward the door, and listened. Silence. Figuring it was nothing, I shrugged it off. I couldn't be away from my desk too long anyway, so I left the door open and went back to work. With no other sounds, I soon forgot about it and focused on my shift. It wasn't until I was nearly done, around 11:30 p.m., that I heard something again. This time, it was softer, but it gave me a bad gut feeling, an unsettling sense of dread. I got up and stepped into the hallway. That's when I saw it. The door at the end of the hallway was wide open. My stomach dropped. That door had been closed. My pulse pounded as I glanced the other way, and that's when I noticed it, a shadow moving along the wall. Someone was standing at the bottom of the stairs. I couldn't see their face, just their figure shifting in the dim light. My body froze before adrenaline kicked in, and I backed into my office, locking the door. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. Every second felt like an eternity as I stared at the crack beneath the door, expecting to see footsteps approach at any moment. But they never did. I didn't hear anything, no footsteps, no movement. When the police arrived and searched the house, there was no sign of anyone. No forced entry, no clues. Nothing. The scariest part. My office door had been open the entire time. Whoever it was must have walked right past me while I was sitting there, completely unaware with my headphones on. I still don't know how they got in or what they wanted, and those unanswered questions still haunt me to this day. A few winters ago, I rented a cabin in a rural town near a ski resort I visit every year. The resort itself was too expensive to stay at, so cabins like mine were a popular alternative. I had been there for a few days, spending my time skiing, and on this particular day, I got back around 7 p.m. I had cut my day short because the cold became unbearable once the sun went down. After showering and eating, I settled by the fireplace to relax. That's when I heard footsteps crunching through the snow. They stopped right outside the door. I got up, expecting a knock, but for several seconds, nothing happened. Then, finally, there was a knock. Feeling uneasy, I cautiously approached and opened the door. A man stood there, late 30s, dark hair, thick beard. He flinched slightly when he saw me, but it felt oddly delayed, almost staged. "Can I help you?" I asked. He smiled and asked who I was. I asked him the same, and he claimed to have booked the cabin for the night. I knew that wasn't true, I had reserved it for the entire week. I asked if he had a receipt or confirmation, but he fumbled through an excuse. Now, it was really strange. I told him he must be mistaken and started to close the door, but he suddenly placed his hand on it, stopping me. Could I maybe come inside for a minute while I figure this out? Just to escape the cold. His smile returned, but something about him felt deeply wrong. I shook my head. Sorry, I can't help you. Then, I shut and locked the door. I stood there for a few seconds, listening. He didn't move at first. For what felt like 30 seconds, he just stood there before finally walking away. It was unsettling, but I figured if something was truly wrong, I'd hear about it later. Trying to shake it off, I turned on the TV and scrolled on my phone, eating a few snacks. About 2 hours passed, and I was getting tired. But just as I was about to sleep, the man suddenly popped into my head again. Something didn't sit right. Curious, I got up and checked outside. The cold night stretched before me, but something else caught my eye, someone standing at the edge of the woods. I couldn't tell if it was the same man, but I had no reason to think it wasn't. My stomach twisted. I went back inside and called the property management. They immediately contacted the police. Thankfully, 2 officers arrived quickly, walking down the snowy path. The man noticed them, but he didn't get far before they stopped him. What they found on him was disturbing. He carried a sling bag filled with tools commonly used for breaking into homes, along with a hunting knife. There was no record of him booking the cabin, meaning his story had been a complete lie. He had been trying to find an easy way in. Had I ignored my instincts and gone to sleep without checking, I might not even be here to tell this story today. I was driving home from work late one winter night. It had been snowing, not a blizzard, but enough to make the road slick and demand careful driving. The temperature was well below freezing. That night, I had left the office sometime around 1 or 2 a.m., and the roads were eerily quiet. As I approached an intersection, the red light forced me to stop. There were no other cars in sight, and I found myself zoning out, thinking about how much I just wanted to get home and sleep. Out of nowhere, a sudden knock against my truck made me jump. My heart pounded as I turned toward the passenger window. A woman stood there. I had no idea where she came from. She looked to be in her late 20s, her face pale from the cold. When I rolled the window down, she apologized for startling me and explained that her car had broken down about a mile back. She had tried walking home but underestimated just how freezing it was. She asked if I could give her a ride, just a mile further down the road. Something about the way she spoke made me believe her. Maybe it was her nervous smile or how genuinely cold she looked. I hesitated for only a moment before unlocking the door. As soon as she climbed in, she thanked me repeatedly. A couple of minutes later, she asked me to turn into a neighborhood. I passed by this area every day on my commute, but I had never actually driven through it. As soon as I turned in, though, something felt off. The houses were small, old, and run down, almost like a row of trailers. Not long after, my truck started struggling on the unplowed street. The further we went, the worse the road conditions looked. I slowed down and asked if this was a good spot for her to get out. That's when I noticed her expression. Her face had shifted into a frown, but as soon as she saw me looking, she forced another polite smile and asked me to drive a little further. Something in my gut told me not to. When I hesitated, she asked again, this time, her voice was less friendly. I explained that I didn't want to risk getting stuck in the snow, but she kept insisting, even trying to guilt-trip me. That was enough for me. I firmly told her no and that she needed to get out. Her friendly demeanor vanished. She looked angry but opened the door and stepped out. As I started a 3-point turn to get out of there, my headlights briefly illuminated the area ahead. That's when I saw them, figures standing near the tree line, just beyond the houses. They were right in the direction she had been trying to lead me. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't stick around to find out who they were or what they wanted. I hurried to get out of there as fast as possible, my tires slipping slightly on the icy road. I don't know exactly what kind of situation I almost drove into that night, but I know one thing: if I had kept going, or worse, gotten stuck, I might not have made it home at all. That night seemed normal, just another cold winter evening. Snow fell steadily outside as I followed my usual routine, coming home from work, making dinner, and heading to bed. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise. It was the distinct creak of wood, a deep, groaning sound that made me think of the roof settling or maybe even a leak. I wasn't too alarmed, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep unless I at least checked. Keeping the lights off so I wouldn't wake myself up too much, I got out of bed and walked into the hallway. I decided to start with the spare room, which I mostly used for workout equipment. The ceiling looked fine, no water stains, no dripping. Everything seemed normal. I wandered over to the window, pulling the curtains aside. It was still snowing, but lightly, definitely not enough to explain the noise. Maybe I had exaggerated how loud it was. Still, just to be sure, I decided to check the other rooms. I walked into the next room, looking up again. Nothing unusual. But as I took a few steps further in, I felt it, my foot suddenly cold and wet. I looked down to find a damp spot in the carpet. Confused, I looked up again, assuming there had to be a leak. Yet, the ceiling was completely dry. I turned on the light, and that's when I saw them, several wet spots trailing from the window all the way to the door. My stomach tightened. I backed out into the hallway, my eyes following the damp footprints. They didn't stop at the room. They continued, leading all the way to my bedroom. My heart pounded. I turned to my open bedroom door, my breath catching as I saw the footprints disappear inside. I didn't wait. I bolted to the kitchen, grabbed my keys, and drove away. By the time an officer arrived to check the house, it was empty. No signs of forced entry, no one inside. Maybe they were already gone by the time I woke up, or maybe they had still been in my room when I first got up, slipping past while I was distracted. Either way, the thought of someone standing in my bedroom, watching me sleep, sends a chill down my spine. The noise I heard was almost certainly them, either sneaking in or slipping out. What they wanted, or what could have happened, I'll never know. The blizzard that night was relentless. The snow came down so thick that I could barely see a few feet beyond my window. Knowing the roads would be dangerous, I called off work and stayed inside, spending the evening curled up on the couch watching TV. Something about the heavy snow made it feel like the perfect night to just relax. At some point, I must have dozed off, probably around 8 or 9. I woke up suddenly to the sound of a cough. Just one. It was faint, and I couldn't tell exactly where it came from, whether inside or outside. My mind was still groggy, but something felt off. The house was pitch black. I must have been asleep for hours. Still half asleep, I walked over to the window. The storm was still raging, the snow completely obscuring any view outside. Was the sound real? Or had I just dreamed it? As I turned to head back to the couch, something flickered in the corner of my vision, movement in the hallway. I flicked on the light, my heart pounding. I stared down the hall, my voice barely steady as I called out, "Is someone there?" Silence. But the feeling of being trapped started creeping in. I couldn't run out into the storm. I had no choice but to stay inside, possibly with someone else. Steeling myself, I crept forward, my footsteps barely making a sound. Then, just before I reached the end of the hallway, there was a sudden series of quick thumps, followed by the howling wind blasting through the house. I rounded the corner just in time to see it. The window at the far end of the room was wide open. Someone had just escaped into the blizzard. For a moment, my body locked up, but I forced myself forward, slamming the window shut and locking it. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called the police. By the time they arrived, the intruder was long gone. Any footprints or evidence had already been erased by the relentless snow. There was no way to know who had been in my home or what they wanted. But the idea that they had been there, watching, waiting, I haven't been able to shake that feeling since. I'm a 28-year-old male living in a small house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The town is bordered by a vast forest stretching for hundreds of miles. I enjoy walking along the trails near my backyard, though I usually don't have time until later in the evening. I don't mind, it's peaceful having the trails to myself with just a headlamp to guide the way. One particular night, around 8 p.m., the weather was mild, so I threw on my coat and set off. As always, the forest was calm and quiet, but as I ventured deeper, I thought I heard something. I stopped and scanned the trees. That's when I saw a figure, a child, maybe 8 or 10 years old, standing just beyond the trail. It was too dark to make out details, but they appeared to be alone. Concerned, I called out, "Hey, are you okay? The way back is this way." But the child didn't move. I took a few steps toward them, debating whether to call someone or try to help them myself. If I left, the odds of someone finding them later seemed slim. So I approached carefully, urging them to follow me back. Instead, they began stepping backward, not running, but deliberately keeping within sight. It felt as though they were leading me deeper into the forest. At the time, I was too focused on helping to realize how strange this was. I followed for a couple of minutes until the child disappeared behind a structure. It was a small, decrepit shed, old and out of place in the middle of the woods. Before I could investigate, I heard footsteps, heavy ones. My stomach dropped. Someone else was there. A sudden wave of dread washed over me. I instinctively shut off my headlamp and turned back the way I came, sprinting until I reached home. My hands were still shaking as I called 911. The police had no reports of a missing child but agreed to send an officer. I led them back to the shed, but by then, it was empty. Weeks passed, and I assumed nothing would come of it. But then, the city decided to tear down the unauthorized structure. That's when they found something linked to an old kidnapping case. The details were never fully disclosed, kept private for reasons I don't understand. I still don't know who that child was or whose footsteps I heard. Was it really a trap? Or was something, some force, trying to lead me to the truth? The thought haunts me to this day. I used to work at a gas station, and this happened one January night, right after the holiday rush. Around here, the winters get brutally cold, and this night was no exception. I was scheduled for a late shift, not quite overnight, but until 3 a.m. The wind was howling outside, and the temperature was barely above zero. Even stepping outside for a minute felt unbearable. Given the weather, barely anyone stopped by that night. Around midnight, a man walked into the store. I hadn't heard a car pull up, which startled me. He didn't move further inside, just stood near the door, staring out through the glass. I greeted him, and he gave me a small nod before returning his gaze outside. That's when I noticed there were no cars in the lot. He must have walked here. Trying to keep things casual, I asked, "How are you doing tonight, sir?" He turned his head slightly and replied, "Fine. Just waiting for my ride. Thought I'd take shelter from the cold." I nodded. "Yeah, of course. Stay as long as you need." I didn't press for more details. Maybe his car broke down nearby, or he was just stranded. It wasn't unusual for people to seek warmth in places like this. I busied myself with stocking shelves and tidying up, keeping an eye on him every so often. But an hour passed, and he was still there, standing in the exact same spot. At that point, I started feeling uneasy. "Do you need to use the phone?" I asked. "Maybe call to check on your ride?" "No, I'm good," he said, not looking at me. I nodded, but something about the way he stood there, motionless, felt off. Where had he even walked from? There weren't any nearby houses or buildings where someone could have come from on foot in this weather. Another 30 minutes passed. The store was dead silent except for the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. I was scrolling through my phone when I noticed the man shift. He straightened up slightly, then turned his head to look directly at me. His expression was vacant, his eyes dull, almost lifeless. Before I could say anything, headlights flooded the parking lot. A car pulled in and stopped right in front of the store. But no one got out. The man kept staring at me for a second, then turned and walked toward the car. The driver rolled down the window, and instead of getting in, they started talking. Their conversation was too quiet for me to hear, but I could see the way they were looking back at the store, at me. Something in my gut screamed at me that this wasn't right. I stepped around the counter, walked to the door, and quickly locked it. The man immediately snapped his head toward me. His expression darkened, and in an instant, he lunged at the door, grabbing the handle and yanking it hard. The driver got out too, rushing to the door, trying to force it open. Their aggression sent my pulse racing. They were furious. I ran back behind the counter and grabbed the phone, dialing the police as fast as I could. My hands shook as I watched them through the glass, still struggling to get in. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they stopped. The moment they saw me on the phone, they turned back to the car, got in, and sped off into the night. By the time the police arrived, they were long gone. I gave them as much of a description as I could, but they never found the man or the driver. To this day, I don't know what they were planning, but I know it wasn't good. And I know that if I hadn't locked that door when I did, I might not be here to tell this story.